From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. The amazing inside story of Steve Jobs and Pixar and the making of entertainment and tech history. Today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Lawrence Levy is a Silicon Valley lawyer and an executive hired by Steve Jobs in 1994 as chief financial officer and a member of the office of the president of Pixar Animation Studios. He was responsible for Pixar's business strategy, guiding its IPO through the system, and transforming a money-losing graphics company into a multi-billion-dollar entertainment studio. And more recently, he left corporate life to study Eastern philosophy and meditation and their relevance to modern life, co-founding Juniper Foundation. His first book, To Pixar and Beyond My Unlikely Journey with Steve Jobs to Make Entertainment History. Welcome, Lawrence. How are you?
Great, Jim. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
I got to tell you that even though people obviously know the ending, the book is mesmerizing, and you kind of keep going page by page to see if they're going to make it. And, this is a different technology. It was an animation studio. They generally don't go public by themselves. You had a deal that favored Disney as a partner. All these things stacked against you. Is it the magic of Jobs?
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that you found it to be a page-turner. When I went to my literary agent about writing the book, I said, I'm going to make a page-turner out of an IPO. And they, dared me to do it. There were many sources of the magic of Pixar, and as kind of the book reveals, it was just a lot of things coming together. It was really a marriage between these creative forces, these technology forces, and these business forces. And it was Pixar's ability to harness all of that, which was no easy stroke to pull off, but it was the ability to harness all of it that enabled it to become, what it did.
And Steve Jobs put about $50 million into Pixar over a lot of years, which you'll talk about. Disney bought them for $7 billion, and at one point, I think the stock was worth $13 billion. So that's quite a return. But it's interesting to me is that I got a sense that the success might have been in spite of Jobs, at least initially, right? Because he wasn't there every day, and B, the creative guys didn't feel that comfortable with him.
Well, that's true. It certainly evolved into a company that was different than was originally envisioned. When Steve left Apple originally, way back in the mid-1980s, he kind of went off on these trajectories to try to develop new hardware products. One of them was Next Computer, and that kind of flamed out a few years later. And the other one was Pixar. The original vision for Pixar was to make a graphics computer to do this super high-end graphics. And that got shut down around 1991. So the original vision for Pixar wasn't to be an entertainment company. In fact, when I arrived at Pixar in early 1995, no one, including Pixar, conceived of the company as an entertainment company. And that was actually something that came a little bit later as we put together the strategy for shaping the company.
He's fired from Apple. Next, as you said, basically kind of a failure as well. How important was Pixar to basically turning him back into, even for himself, to feel that he was a success?
Well, I think Pixar was his comeback after a long period in the wilderness. And the moment of that was the Pixar IPO, because even at the time I met Steve, it's funny looking back, but in 1994 when I met Steve, people, everyone would say to me, why would you go work for Steve Jobs? Because he had been kind of written off at that point as having never really made it back after being forced out of Apple. And so the moment, if there was a moment that sort of that solidified that comeback, it was definitely Pixar's IPO, because nobody could argue with the sort of success and meaning of that.
So tell us how you were able to work so successfully with Jobs when, so many people found it rather difficult.
We had chemistry from the get-go. And so from the very beginning, and, we hit it off, and people had said, you sort of avoid that and don't go do that. And I was sort of trusting my own instincts in a way. And I was like, no, we're working well from the beginning. And what I found the process was a basic constant dialogue and discussion over all the issues that we faced. And there were many of them. And but it was never about sort of Steve, lording over everything and demanding things to be a certain way. At least in my relationship with him, he respected the debate, and we didn't always agree. We often took different positions on things, but we preferred to kind of duke it out until we came to a conclusion that we were all happy with. And that process of collaboration was, I think, the formula in a way that worked for us.
Very interesting. Corporate culture is obviously something that's critical to ultimate success. Describe a little bit. You come in there, first off, they're in like 4 businesses, none of them really working or making a lot of money, and they don't really necessarily understand how to get to a business model that's successful. Steve doesn't seem to understand. How did you come in and put this whole process and sort of end up getting a team in alignment? Initially,
in a way, quietly, I realized very, very quickly that it was going to take a big shift, within the company, and I didn't know if the company was sort of ready for that or not. And so I decided, and I expressly asked Steve about this. I said, I need to take time to really get the pulse of Pixar. And not, there's often a tendency you're new in a place and you want to make changes quickly and show your impact. I kind of took the opposite approach, which is that let me just observe, and not change anything until I really understand how this place works. And I took a couple of months and I just sort of followed people around. I was really the proverbial fly on the wall. And through that process, I was able to sort of get what was going on at Pixar, and from that sort of forge this business model that eventually emerged.
Now, they had a software product. They did short films. They did commercials. And then, of course, the goal to be an animated film place. How did you sort of winnow 3 of those out, and how did you get the culture to accept that?
Well, I had to learn the economics of each of those businesses. I had some experience in software, and these were amazing products, by the way. The short films were winning awards. The software, which was RenderMan,
yep.
Was the best of its kind, still is the best of its kind in the field. Pixar was making commercials, and they were winning Clio awards for them, so it was all great stuff. It's just that none of it had any business growth potential. RenderMan, by its nature, being such a high-end product, was valuable to 50 or 75 or 100 studios as and when they wanted to do high-end special effects. But besides that, there were just no markets that were big enough. So these products could keep a small team of 5, 10, or a dozen people, working for steadily, but for growing a business, they had no upside. And so that just, once I realized that, then I, sort of gently presented these ideas first to Steve and Ed and John, and then, slowly the company fell into line.
Now, you had a deal with Disney that almost made it impossible for you guys to make any money out of it, really, at the time.
Yes, and had I known that even before I stepped into Pixar, it's funny how sometimes naivete is a requirement for doing something crazy. I probably wouldn't have joined the company, and you'd think I would have known that because I was a lawyer, and I just thought, and I understood contracts, but I just said, I looked at the contract and I said, I'll just get my head around that whole thing later. Mm-hmm. What I didn't know at the time was that sort of Hollywood contracts are written in kind of a code, and when you have to learn the code. And when I did learn the code, it was really like my jaw fell on the floor because I realized, wow, Pixar had been tied up in a way that it looked to me that you could almost never get out of, at least not short of 10 or 12 years.
As we get down to the last minute of this segment, what do you think that your and Steve Jobs' biggest single decision was made to make this successful?
There was the biggest single decision. I would say it was a decision to not interfere with the creative process of the creative people at Pixar, and actually devote a whole chapter to that decision.
It's a very gutsy decision, right?
It's a very gutsy decision because executives by nature, and because creative mistakes are very expensive mistakes. Yeah. If you're halfway into a film and you decide to change your main character, it can cost $10-15 million in changes. And so it takes a lot of courage to allow your creative team to have sort of free reign. The instinct of an executive is when things go wrong to step in and fix it. In the creative process at Pixar, we made a decision not to do that, and that was both pivotal and difficult.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the BizTalk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. You can go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the Internet, or access our podcasts. Coming next, two big numbers, the race for Toy Story box office and the IPO. And we're back with former Pixar CFO Lawrence Levy, Toy Story to success story. So what obviously the big runway was to get Toy Story out the door to premiere, and you needed almost incredible opening box office results to be able to turn that into an IPO. Talk a little bit about that process, and also tell folks about John Lasseter.
Well, John Lasseter is, he's kind of the Mozart of his generation in terms of animation. He really is the sort of the lifeblood of sort of animated storytelling just flows through him. And not only is he a great film director himself, one of the secrets to Pixar as well is that he was also brilliant at identifying other directors. So Andrew Stanton, who did WALL-E, Pete Docter, who did Monsters and Up, and all the films that we know and love. All of those directors were sort of handpicked and groomed by John, and so he was able to do both of those things. Leading up to Toy Story, it was a kind of a leap of faith because we didn't know if the public would have an appetite for 90 minutes of this new medium of computer animation. It just had never been tested before, and so I think just Pixar made a film it was really proud of, and it put it out there, but it did it, just with a deep breath, and let's see what happens next, because we really didn't know.
And then the box office numbers are all-time records. What I find kind of intriguing is that the business model ends up being blockbusters, which would seem inherently risky, but Apple's ended up the same way too, right, which is continual blockbuster products.
Yeah, well, it's a crazy kind of business model, but in that particular industry of animated feature film, and it happens in other places as well, it was the only business model, it was the only shot to build an independent animated feature film studio. And so it's like we had to go for it almost by default. And then the questions come, how often are you going to make films? And film production budgets and things like that. So there are other elements to it. But it is a business where you're trying to hit it out of the park every time you're up at bat.
And tell us what it grossed. Was it almost the top-grossing film of the year, right?
Yeah. Oh, it grossed in the domestic box office. It grossed over $190 million domestically, which made it beat the other contenders that year, and that was. So it's funny. Like at the time, we just couldn't believe it. It was more than we'd ever dreamed. And of course, since then, the follow-on films have done better and better and better.
So that leads you into trying to get an IPO done, and that wasn't as easy as you expected. Too, the leading investment banks, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman, were they too risk-averse, or what? No,
I don't think they were too risk-averse. I think that Pixar had. When you try to take a company public, generally the investors, they look for stability. They want to see predictability. They want to see steady growth. They want to see a growth rate. They really like stability. Mm-hmm. And Pixar had none of that. It was the opposite. It was like, we don't have stability. We can't predict our revenues. It's likely to be lumpy.
We don't have a good deal with Disney.
We don't have a good deal with Disney, and so it was the kind of thing that, and we were very upfront about those risks. And yet on the other side, it was very clearly a play to build the next great mm-hmm. animated entertainment studio, and that hadn't been done essentially since the 1940s. With the work of Walt Disney, obviously, and no one had really pulled off that kind of thing. So investors believed in that dream, and so some signed up for that, but others of the investors and investment banks found that the kind of dynamics of the business were too risky for them, and that was fine. We understood that.
So you took this firm and got, I think, an initial IPO valuation of $1.5 billion, which to me is just as amazing as Toy Story's opening. But Jobs initially didn't really share any equity, right?
Well, he owned all the equity, so he was 100% owner, and one of the challenges of the company was basically sharing the equity among, there were a lot of people who had been with Pixar for a long time, hadn't seen any reward for that, and wanted to have the kind of classic Silicon Valley stock option opportunity, and that required, basically taking stock from Steve and giving it to employees. And so that was something that became very important to Pixar's future. It sounds like a boring thing, like a stock option plan, but strategically, if you don't have a way to keep this incredible talent, then you'll lose it. You'll lose that talent, and that'll be the end of the sort of creative capacity. So that became very important to put that in place.
You'll probably be too modest, but were you the one responsible for being able to convince him?
Well, yes, it was my job to put that option plan in place. That was one of the most difficult things that I did, because our option plans, they normally go in place when a company starts. And so you do a startup here in Silicon Valley, you're going to have an option plan almost by default. It's very rare to do it when a company is kind of like 10 years into it, or even longer, into its history. You're like midstream, and you're trying to put something in place and make up for like the past 10 years. So that was very challenging.
Now, you renegotiated the Disney deal, and I think you got a tremendous deal. Talk about that.
Well, that was both one of the hardest deals that I ever was part of negotiating. In my life, Steve and I did that. It took a better part of 18 months or 2 years to get it done, and we basically came up with the deal points that we felt were essential to Pixar for the long term, and we were willing to sort of sacrifice the deal if we didn't get those points. So we were willing to be patient and just ride out the old deal if it came down to that. And a lot of times that's the hardest part of kind of negotiation. We didn't have a kind of plan B. There were profit-sharing things that we needed, brand things that we needed, distribution requirements that we needed. And so we studied that very, very closely, and then but it took a really long time.
Very impressive. You got co-equal branding for Pixar and Disney. You got creative control, and they are control freaks. You got them to release it in the best times of the year. You got the profit split, so very impressive. By the way, since Disney's bought them, have they kept the creative freedom at Pixar?
Yes. I was very involved in that deal because I was still on Pixar's board of directors at the time. And from Pixar's side, that was one of the most important points of the deal, was the ability to maintain Pixar's culture and creative freedom, and even bring that culture and creative structure into Disney's animation unit. And I credit Bob Iger with this, because Disney's CEO, he agreed, to do that at the time of the deal, and he stuck to that. He really did. And so what you have today is kind of Pixar having the same freedom as it always did, and now you see Disney's animation unit producing these amazing films too. So that is a deal that worked out.
It was a win-win. We're talking with Lawrence Levy about the success of Pixar and Steve Jobs. We'll be right back with more. Talking with Lawrence Levy about the success of Pixar and Steve Jobs. Let me ask you, the fact it took 16 years or whatever, most people think that these things, becoming billionaires is an overnight success. Talk about it not really being an overnight success.
Well, I think products generally require much more gestation than we think. Innovation is the product of obviously people doing innovative work, but it's also the result of a lot of conditions that have to be in place to enable things to happen. All the things we see today, whether it's the though they just appeared out of nowhere instantly. But they didn't, because they required a lot of things to be in place to enable that to happen. And so I think that that appearance sort of belies a reality that required a lot of conditions to be brewing.
If we look at Jobs, the family, he made family trade-offs. You kind of get the feeling of, when you guys take walks together, and even he gets very sick, and you're at the same time kind of thinking of doing something different, which we'll talk about. Was he a happy guy? Did he? Do you think he missed too much of a chunk of his life? Where's this drive and everything from?
It's a good question. I think he loved his work. He loved making products. He loved Apple. No question about it. But he also had a family. He had a wife. He had 3 children. He cherished them. I think that he, like everyone else, sort of had to find where the balance was.
Something I did not know, or the way you interpret it, he goes back to Apple, and I remember he doesn't take a salary. And I thought that was kind of a really bold bet. But the way you kind of presented it was he was minimizing his risk by saying, these guys are driving the firm off the cliff, and I'll go in and give my best, but, I have sort of it minimizes his risk by not taking money.
I think that's right. I think when he went back to Apple, he was genuinely, concerned whether they had gone too far, whether they couldn't be pulled back off the edge. And although he was full of ideas and full of excitement and energy to bring it back off of the edge, at that moment in time, it wasn't clear. And so, he certainly didn't want to, sort of be held responsible for not bringing it back off the edge when he wasn't the one that drove it off the edge in the first place. And so I think that set him up in a way to be able to do that.
Because of his sort of arrogance and ego, do you think if he hadn't failed in the first round at Apple and Next, and then been a success at Pixar, if he hadn't gone through that, he never would have done what he did in this Act 2 at Apple?
Well, I would say that only because, partly because that's what happened. We can never pull out even one thing out of history and pretend things would have been the same. I certainly think that what happened at Pixar was very formative, both in terms of the way he worked, in terms of him having a success, having a comeback, in terms of his knowledge also about the entertainment industry. He goes back into Apple with a deep knowledge of the entertainment industry. And also, of course, he had a deep knowledge of the computer industry. And a few years later, as he's reshaping the record industry and other parts of the entertainment industry, this information matters a lot. And so those things all, I think, were important.
Fascinating. Let me ask you this. I don't believe that he knew you well or anything when you first met. What gave him the gut sense to hire and basically hand you Pixar?
Well, that's a good question. I really, I don't know. I think that he trusted me, and I think, what we did, I wouldn't even say sort of he handed me Pixar. I would say he trusted that together we would work it out, and that I would be, although he wouldn't be there himself, I would be sort of on the ground while he was still at Next, that that he trusted that even though I was there and he wasn't, it would still be a partnership. It would still be the two of us together, and I think that mattered to him a lot and probably contributed, to why he did it.
What do you come away with as the basic differences between the tech and entertainment worlds?
The world up here in Silicon Valley has the sort of pulse of innovation. It's just a hotbed for newness. It's just like a rich pond of innovation. I discovered, funnily enough, that Hollywood, which does have pockets of sort of creativity and innovation, it's also an industry that is in some ways can be more conservative as well. Yeah. And there are trends that films and music go by, and so it's a little bit harder sometimes for really new innovation in music and film and TV. Is a little more rare. that's why I think, Pixar was so rare, and maybe it mattered that Pixar was, not a little away from Hollywood in a way. So I think when you look at Hollywood, you see innovation coming out sort of from, like, you have to look for these little pockets where this great work and great innovation is allowed to happen. In Silicon Valley, it's kind of like all over.
Yeah, you kind of get the impression that in the Hollywood, that sequels and things that have already worked is how they manage risk, as opposed to boldness and trying new things.
Right, and this is just has to do. It's not to be critical of one or the other. It just has to do with the kind of nature of their business models and the way the industries are structured.
Don't they kind of play around with the how profit is calculated so it goes into their pockets?
Well, in doing deals they do, but in terms of they certainly do that in doing deals.
All right, let's as we get down towards the end, how do you end up going from Steve Jobs to sort of meditation, Eastern philosophy, sort of where you are now?
Well, I came to see that I had a great career and I loved what I did, but I did sort of see a kind of one-dimensionality, if you will, in what I was doing, and I could see that corporate life, in a way, for as much as I value it and for as much as we need it, it also can be one-dimensional in the sense that it's about acquisition and growth at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to feel that sometimes those costs can be very heavy in terms of stress, in terms of quality of life, how we feel about ourselves, and whether we really sort of feel we kind of experience joy and fulfillment in life. And I wanted to go off and explore more deeply about that. I had a long-term interest in philosophy, and I was really drawn to these ancient kind of meditation traditions. And so I went off to study that very deeply, and I realized and I learned in doing so that, I believe that in some ways corporate life can go too far, and it can lose the sort of, it can squash sort of the human side of how we live and how we do things. And there's a place for integrating both, and I'm really interested in that integration and doing more work in that area now.
What is Juniper Foundation?
Juniper Foundation is an organization created about 10 years ago to basically bring a 2,000-year-old tradition of meditation and contemplation into contemporary life. The thesis of it is that there is unbelievable wisdom in these ancient meditation traditions. It's sort of inaccessible to us because it comes in sort of with cultural baggage that we don't relate to from cultures 500 or 1,000 years old. But the insight, the wisdom, the practices are as fresh as the day that they were created. So we have to embed them in our own culture, and that's what Juniper Foundation is all about.
Are you doing any corporate work anymore? Or?
No, not really, although I've gotten some inquiries after I put the book out there. And, who knows, I might get a little bit more involved, but it'll be certainly to represent these kinds of ideas. I wouldn't be going back as a CFO or anything like that, but it would be to bring to that world some of the things we've been talking about.
What was the reason that you waited so long to write this?
I'd been encouraged to write this story for quite some time, but I was kind of busy doing other things. And then a couple of things happened. One, tragically, of course, Steve died. And then there's this huge array of books and documentaries and movies about him. And I began to think to myself, the story was often like, he left Apple in the 80s and he went back to Apple in the 90s. And I'm like, but this thing that happened in the middle with Pixar was really important. And so I began to feel that I didn't write this down. It was a story that was never told. And so that was one thing. And then the second thing was that, as I get to at the end of the book, I could see how I could use Pixar as kind of a metaphor to illustrate some of these deeper ideas about the middle way in life and meditation. And so the possibility of doing that also excited me. So then I'm like, I originally did it as a talk that I gave at Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School and Pixar as well, actually, and that talk went over really well. And so then I was like, okay, time to write the book.
Talking with Lawrence Levy about the success of Pixar and Steve Jobs. We'll be right back with more. Talking with Lawrence Levy about the success of Pixar and Steve Jobs.
My son, who is a great writer, and he's a very he does a lot of work in story, and he's very creative. And he said to me in the middle, he said, you know what you got going for your dad? I said, what's that? He said, you don't think you can write a book. I'm like, well, what kind of a compliment is that?
Yeah.
And he said, in his experience, he said the biggest difficulty that people have is that the ego gets in the way of listening to what people are telling them. And he said that's usually where the downfall of so many creative projects. And he says, you're listening to the people that you're seeking advice from. You're like actually hanging on their every word. And he said that's much more of an advantage than you think.
Interesting. That's a fast. How old was your kid then?
Well, my son, Jason, is the one in the book, and he's now 31.
Oh.
And he studied story and such, for the better part of 10 years, and he now works in that field too. And I guess I would say, I was running scared, and I also understood the sort of power of collaboration in a way. And in fact, I just wrote a piece on that got published in the Harvard Business Review on the relationship between kind of ego and collaboration.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'll have to take a look at it. So when Jobs is in the wilderness, sort of this post-Apple first round and next, and then to Pixar, and then he goes back to Apple and he hits a home run. Did you find him, and obviously you knew him less then or spent less time, did he change in any fundamental ways?
I'm not sure I would say that. I mean, I think we remained close throughout all those years, and I think when he went back to Apple, I mean, his life changed, obviously. I mean, he became, sort of a mega star in every corner of the world once he went back to Apple. But he loved great products. He loved quality. He loved technology. And, I think he was just always immersed in thinking about those things.
I noticed in the back of the book you said that you used a coach or something. Does that mean a co-writer or?
Not a co-writer. He was a writing coach, and so he was the other person. It was like my son and him. He was just a reader. He was a critic, basically, and he read all the drafts, and it was merciless, by the way. He was just merciless. I mean, when he was recommended to me, I was told that he won't pull any punches, and he may not even have the best bedside manner, but he's really, really good. And, my Pixar experience helped a lot with this. I know very well.
Creative types?
Yeah, with creative types and the process of developing stores or any sort of large-scale, high-quality creative work, this very challenging balance between your sort of personal drive to do good work and the capacity to listen to the right people. And but this is Jamie, working with on the book was just merciless. At the beginning, I turned to my wife one time and said, I don't care about the book anymore. I just want a gold star from Jamie. And at the end of the whole thing, I told him that, and he said, okay, he'll send me a universe of gold stars. So I got my gold star.
How is he compensated?
Well, I sort of pay him, that was my responsibility to pay him, and in this case, he would have done it by the project or by the hour, and I paid him by the hour. And that worked out. I was the key is to find the right people. That's the key.
The right people.
The right people to collaborate with, to get what you're trying to do, have the talent and the skill to sort of hold your feet to the fire, and not just sort of confirm like what it is you're doing, but to be, to have their own sort of independent view and sort of team with you, partner with you. So I wrote it, but I had these collaborators that were reading the passages and giving me kind of in the forms of email or lists or however it was, just feedback, and then I would go through the feedback and I would sort of keep polishing up the text. And then I did something I was really nervous because a lot of the people in the book are obviously still around. They're real people, and I was, telling their story as well, and they're part of the Pixar thing. And I did my absolute best to capture it as I remembered it, but I didn't want to sort of risk saying something that putting words in their mouths that they felt that they didn't say. So when I had a really good first draft, they all read it. So every person in the book had a chance to read it, and that was great. It was wonderful actually, and it jogged their memories a little bit, and But I had actually done. They didn't make a lot of changes, but where they did it just made it richer. But that also gave me a lot of confidence after they read it.
You can see why you're successful. You really are able to control your ego very well.
Well, I think there's something to say for that. People ask me this all the time. It's just that you can be successful and have a out-of-control ego. And
as our current president.
Exactly, and so it's not it's not a question of one or the other, but it depends on the way you want to be, the way you want to live your life and encounter. And so that's just always been a way that I've found ultimately a more sort of fulfilling way to be, is try to get the ego out of the way, and because then, like a lot of other things, will kind of flow in.
Interesting. Let me ask you this: when you're there and you start off, you're in this sort of ratty headquarters. Now it sounds like they're in a beautiful building. Have they been able to avoid becoming a bureaucracy or complacent? How about that?
Well, I would say yes, they have, but it's never easy. It's a constant battle, not so much to do with the building or such, but Pixar understands that when you come up to make a new film, you don't get to rest on your laurels because you just made a film before. So it never takes success for granted, and that's not an easy thing, I would say, because there is a tendency to, on the one hand, you can feel insecure because you're coming off this success, and how can you repeat it? And then on the other hand, you can sort of feel infallible as well because you've had hit after hit, and so it's a constant, like every time you're up to the plate, you've got to resurrect that same sort of drive and humility and same way, not take anything for granted.
Well, I have to say it is a page turner, and it's just a great story. You see this what appears to be against all odds in every direction.
Yeah, it was.
It's written by Lawrence Levy. He was the CFO at Pixar. It's called To Pixar and Beyond, My Unlikely Journey with Steve Jobs to Make Entertainment History. And anything with Jobs is always fascinating. You've been listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thank you very much, Lawrence.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you, Jim.